Hello. Downing Street says it's not time for the election yet. You could have phoned me. The Prime Minister was facing the lunchtime ladies and speechifying at lecterns too. Keir Starmer was oh so subtly rolling up his shirt sleeves at a glossy party event with his new brand, his first steps. But whoever is in charge, Russia is on the march again in Ukraine. We speak to Alexei Navalny's close friend who was battered and attacked himself. He tells me why he will never give up the fight against Putin. Morning, morning. There is something in the air. It wasn't Tony Blair's pledge card or Ed Miliband's Ed Stone, remember that? But after Rishi Sunak's 5 pledges, it was Keir Starmer this week unveiling his 6 first steps. Remember that? Let's see who's been paying attention in the last few days. The Defence Secretary Grant Shapps is here, as is Labour's Wes Streeting, who wants to be the next Health Secretary. Now, if you can, you two, I'm going to do a bit of a test. Grant Shapps, the 5 pledges, what are they?
It's about growing the economy, reducing debt, bring down inflation, cutting the waiting lists and stopping the boats. 5 out of 5. Wes Streeting, can you do the 6?
Economic stability, cut NHS waiting lists, 6,500 extra teachers, secure border command, Great British Energy, and what's the one I've missed? I've done them out of order. Oh,
we can show you.
Luckily,
if you forget all you're looking in your pledge. He's got his pledge card. There you are.
There we are. No, I've got one here.
You've got crackdown on antisocial behaviour.
Well, do you know, the annoying thing is, I was sort of preparing for that question. I still fluffed it. I might as well just go home now.
Well, we had 5 out of 5 and 5 and 6. 5 out of 6. I can't count now, which is a bit of a problem. But they just about got through it. With me at the desk for the whole show, the broadcaster Piers Morgan, Mikaela Loach, the climate and social justice activist, and David Ross, businessman and entrepreneur, who's given a fortune to the Tories over the years. A very warm welcome to you all this morning. Let's start with the news. Now, the Sunday Telegraph says that Wes Streeting is going to tell doctors they have to work weekends. He's working the weekend today, as you know, so we'll ask him about that later. The Archbishop of Canterbury has told The Observer that Keir Starmer should scrap the 2-child limit on benefit payments if they win. The Mail on Sunday says cuts have left the MOD without enough planes for a planned mass parachute drop to commemorate D-Day. Handily, we have Grant Shapps here to ask him about that. And ahead of a hugely important official report tomorrow on the BBC website, there's the story of the campaigners who've been fighting for justice after the infected blood scandal. The very sad story there of Sue Gorman and Steve Diamond, who did not live to see justice. That's going to be a huge story tomorrow with lots of coverage on that all across the BBC. Let's, though, stick with this week of pledges and platforms, because it's been a big political week. If you had one thing to add to the pledge card, Mikaela, what would it be?
Oh, there's lots of things I think I'd like to add to the pledge cards. I feel like they're definitely not sufficient for what we need in the multiplicity of crises that we're seeing. I mean, we just saw that the Archbishop of Canterbury is saying that the 2-child benefit limit is immoral. Currently, 43% of families that have 3 or more children are living in poverty in this country, and that's abhorrent and ridiculous. And actually scrapping this 2-child benefit limit would actually take 500,000 children out of poverty, and that would be really significant, and also tackle the health crises that we're seeing and relieve pressure on the NHS, and would help all of us.
So that would be what you'd put on. That's interesting, because it was here on the show that Keir Starmer said he wasn't going to go ahead with that, and it was officially dropped, if you like. David, what would you put on there? You've got all sorts of different interests, business, education and the arts. What would you choose?
I'd probably put international competitiveness for our economy, for our society. I think we have to remember that in this day and age, capital and human talent and human resource are all global in where they can be invested and where people can work. And I think we have to have, as we go into the next stage, given everything that's going on in technology and everything else, a real focus on making our country and our economy internationally competitive.
To make it easier to do business here?
Easier to do business, more incentive for investment, more incentives for work, and just generally taking the economy in a very sort of positive, proactive, international
Okay.
way.
That's interesting. So two very different adds to the pledge card. Piers, what would you put on the pledge card? You're not allowed to say Arsenal winning this afternoon.
Actually, well, I was going to say I'd like an immediate pledge from both parties that every West Ham player, should they beat Manchester City today, get a £10 million win bonus from the taxpayer. That would be great. Secondly, I quite like a pledge where they remember what their pledges are. Because if you can't remember what the pledges are, how committed are you to the pledges? But most seriously, I think the biggest crisis facing this country is defence. And that's why I'm interested to see Grant Shapps here and see what he says about this. We are facing a massive crisis in many different ways at the moment, and we do not have the defence capability to defend ourselves. I want to see our defence spending significantly increased.
So what would that pledge be then? Because the government says 2.5%.
I think it should be more. Yeah. You know, you see countries like Poland putting a lot more money into it. I would like to see at least 3, maybe 3.5. We are massively under-resourced when it comes to defence.
OK, really interesting. Well, let's get on with that very subject then in a second. But as it's been all the rage, we've been having a bit of a think about what our pledges to you, our wonderful viewers, should be in an election year, since the political parties have been at it. And we had an initial think, ask firm questions, of course, pursue the facts, of course, hear from you, of course, and, you know, on a Sunday morning, have a bit of fun from time to time. But we would like you to suggest your ideas and your views on pledge cards, mission statements and first steps from Keir Starmer. You can send us an email, as ever, kuenssberg@bbc.co.uk. If you're social media inclined, you can use the hashtag BBC Laura K, or you can follow what's happening on the BBC website as the programme continues. Right then, as we've just been talking, Ukraine has been a huge issue in the last couple of years, and defence, of course, has been rising up the political agenda. And in the last few weeks, there's been a new push with Russian soldiers taking back territory from Ukraine, where Ukraine had already pushed them out. And again, President Zelensky has been asking Western allies for more equipment, more support. The Defence Secretary is with us this morning. It's always good to have you here in the studio. Now, Russia seized another village in the Kharkiv region. People will know that's in the northeast of Ukraine. We've been speaking to Alexei Navalny's former chief of staff, Leonid Volkov. Now, he believes President Putin is actually to show himself as being stronger than he really is. And he says, look, the West shouldn't be sort of bluffed by this. But how would you describe this push into Kharkiv?
Well, I read that interview and he's absolutely right. I mean, Putin in many ways is bluffing this war by putting his entire economy onto a war footing in a way which actually isn't sustainable for Russia over the years that he'd have to continue it for. So it's very important the West does not blink. And when we see what's happened in Kharkiv, the second biggest city in Ukraine, it is because, I'm afraid, the civilized world took their eyes off the ball just for a little while, and we saw how long it took to get that package through the US Congress because of internal politics there. And this is the actual upshot. This is the result of waiting. Now, at the moment,
it's blaming the US then?
Well, not blaming them, but internal politics meant that the money didn't flow in the way that, for example, in the UK, we were giving consistent amounts of money. This year, actually, we upped it again and then have added an extra £500 million, so we're giving £3 billion this year, plus very big gifting packages. It's important that support is consistent, because if you stop, then these are the problems you see. At the moment, it's a few villages on the outskirts of Kharkiv, and it's very, very important that the aid flows to Ukraine so they can push that back, and I think that they will. But let's not get into this mess again. And
it's interesting, though, because you are very directly pointing at the hold-ups in America as being...
America and elsewhere, I should say, because we have given on a very, very consistent basis and, importantly, been very, very forward-leaning. When I speak to my opposite number, Minister Umerov, or indeed President Zelensky, they will say that Ukraine may not be in this war had it not been for Britain being prepared to be so forward-leaning in our support to them. Now, other countries, including other European countries, could be doing more, and we mustn't have this stop-start in this war.
But the UK could also do more. As you say, the UK has been a generous giver to Ukraine. There isn't a dispute about that.
In Ukraine, interestingly, you'll go around Kyiv and you'll see flags which are half Ukrainian, half the
and
Union Jack,
we've been to Ukraine
being sold
for a couple of times. But there is, however, as Piers was just suggesting, as some people in your party feel, there is still more that the UK could do. And some of our viewers think this too. Julie's been in touch. She wants to know, why is the UK not giving Ukraine what they need to defeat Russia? Are we scared of upsetting a bully? And she said, how come it's OK for British and US planes to shoot down Iranian missiles heading towards Israel, which happened a few weeks ago, but not Russian ones pummeling the life out of Ukraine?
So understand, there is a difference. Israel is a democratic country, but it's not in NATO, so it doesn't enjoy the protection, and nor does Ukraine, of course. In the case of Ukraine, they're in a war against Russia, who are trying to undermine NATO. We don't want to be in a direct conflict with Russia, but we are determined to supply the weapons, the resources, the training. 65,000 Ukrainians trained in Britain with partnerships from other countries. So we're doing all of that for Ukraine, but we don't intend to go and fight that war. In Israel, a different set of circumstances, but Iran, whose only interest is keeping themselves in power, theology, attacking a democracy, I think everyone thinks it's right to stop those incoming missiles reaching a democracy in those situations.
But there's a question of principle here, though, isn't there? As Julie, one of our viewers, has very clearly laid out that principle. And what President Zelensky said in the last couple of days, we have about 25% of what we need to defend Ukraine. Just 25%. Now, isn't there more that the UK and its allies should be doing now?
Well, as I say, I think if everybody was acting in the way that the United Kingdom has, Ukraine would clearly have a lot more resource. Remember, we've each year upped the amount of money going to Ukraine to fight the war, in addition to other aid and assistance, probably about £12.5 billion overall so far. We're providing more and more gifting. I've outlined more today of the kind of weapons, often things which are coming to the end of our usefulness, and we're providing them for Ukraine. A lot of land vehicles, a lot of boats and other things, missile defences. And this country has organised internationally for things like the International Fund for Ukraine to collect money from others to provide for Ukraine. My point is, we are the second biggest spender in NATO. We're by far and away the biggest military spender in Europe, as Stoltenberg, the NATO Sec General, said to me last week. What we want is others to match what we're doing, and that will actually help Ukraine.
There's a question, though, also about how they are fighting and how they are allowed to fight. Do you think it would be acceptable for the Ukrainians to use British-supplied weaponry to attack inside Russia?
So we have been very, very clear with the world and helpful to Ukraine in, for example, providing permissions for our weapons to be used throughout the whole of Ukraine. I say the whole.
In Russia, the question here is in Russia.
I'll come to that, but that includes Crimea, which was taken by Putin in 2014. Now, we do not get into how we would allow targeting of our weapons to be used outside of that, but we do provide our weapons to Ukraine in order for them to defend their country. Now, before we get on to, should they be used over borders into Russia, there's also the question of other countries providing those permissions for the weapons to be used in Crimea, because that is a very, very important, the Black Sea is a very important
indeed,
part
but there's a clear request from President Zelensky. He believes there should not be any bans on how his country could use the weapons once they have been granted. Do you, as the British Defence Secretary, think that it should be up to President Zelensky to decide how to use those weapons, or should it be up to the country who've sent them to decide how to use those weapons?
The very, very clear definition here is they are in a war. They need to defend their own territory. I get where you're going at here. I can't go into the specifics of those private conversations about how the weapons are precisely used will end up getting into areas.
So it might happen.
Which I can't go into detail. What I can be absolutely clear about is those weapons can and should and are, in our case, used in the whole of Ukraine, including Crimea. This is very important because the Black Sea and Crimea, it was uncontested after Putin took that in 2014. Since the United Kingdom's involvement and bringing other countries in, like France and America, to support us, that is now very much contested. And the Black Sea Fleet, the Russian Black Sea Fleet, no longer sails in the Black Sea That's the first time for probably 250 years that they've not had the freedom of their own navigation there. So very important to let Ukraine prosecute this war. I can't go into specifics about the way that weapons may be used because we get into great deal of sensitivities.
But there is an important principle, though, here, and actually your colleague David Cameron, the Foreign Secretary, he has talked about this before. American politicians have talked about this before. Why won't you talk about this now?
Simply because I'm the one who actually has to take some of those targeting decisions, and it's not something I can go into on air.
OK. In terms of the general levels of defence spending, a couple of weeks ago, Rishi Sunak said the election of Keir Starmer as Prime Minister would make the country less safe because Labour won't commit to matching your pledge to increase defence spending to 2.5% of the size of the economy. But that's only been the government's policy for a couple of weeks. So was Rishi Sunak a danger last month?
Well, I think we've been building up to the point last month at which we put a firm date on reaching 2.5%. I made a speech at Lancaster House in London in January saying it's a more dangerous world. I used the phrase, perhaps we've moved from a post-war to a pre-war
Yeah, and we discussed that here in the studio. But
and then we worked through, because these things can't happen through wishful thinking. You have to actually say how you're going to pay for it, how we will pay for them. The answer is we would reduce the size of the civil service back to where it was before COVID and use that money to help pay for the increase in defence spending.
Except it was Boris Johnson's policy in 2022. And a couple of weeks ago, Rishi Sunak accused Keir Starmer of being a danger to the nation for not committing to the same thing that just a few weeks ago you hadn't committed to.
So, look, we're getting closer to an election, aren't we? So you have to start.
So it's just electioneering.
So, no, well, let me explain. You have to start setting out your plans, and if you don't have a route to get there, and it's simple wishful thinking, Labour continue to say, we want to get there. People will, I think, quite rightly question whether that's likely to be the case. Why? Well, because Keir Starmer leads a party where dozens of their MPs voted against the nuclear deterrent that he now says is in favour of. Keir Starmer twice supported a leader who wanted to get us out of NATO.
But isn't this exactly the kind of thing, though, that some of our viewers just, it drives them round a twist? Because you're accusing Labour of being a danger for being exactly in the same position that you were in just a matter of weeks ago.
Well, the difference is, I think, we are now getting towards, and we've said there'll be an election in the second half of the year, haven't we?
So we're
getting towards the general election in the second half of the year. It's not unreasonable to expect political parties to set out their platform. If they're unable to, and it's a sort of wishful thinking, we'll get to 2.5%. Oh, but we won't, for example, slim the size of the civil service, as we've said, will do to pay for it. Then how are you going to pay for it? And those are reasonable questions for us and you as the media
but you want
to
be
get
asking. To 3%.
Well, I've talked in the past about that, but the first thing to do is to get us to 2.5%. And I'll tell you why. We need to do this at a speed where we don't just suck in imports in defensive equipment from America and elsewhere. We build our own industrial base. And the path we've set to 2.5% allows us to build up our industry to be able to produce that defence equipment. There are about 400,000 people who work in that industry already, and I want to expand that in a way that makes sense.
I want to talk about Gaza in a second, but I just first of all want to ask you about a story this morning that the UK right now has only got one plane to send to the important D-Day commemorations for a parachute display. Are you going to sort that out?
Well, first of all, I think it's massively important to commemorate and remember the past. Otherwise, we'll end up making the same mistakes in the future. This was only brought to me very recently, and I certainly do want to see that properly covered. So I've no doubt at all we'll have additional planes there. It is actually the case that the A400s, which are the aircraft we use, are being used in operations at the moment. It's one of the reasons why I have argued, and successfully argued, to get £75 billion more in cash terms into our armed forces, because I think we do need to be doing more of these things. OK. Now, the first batch of aid has been delivered across a temporary pier that's been built just off the coast of Gaza, and we can show our viewers pictures of that. We think, though, that there are more than 1 million people in that tiny strip of land without enough food, without enough water, without enough fuel. The world's solution appears to be this floating platform that is shorter than Southend Pier. Do you really think this is going to match up to the scale of the challenge here, which is potentially famine among more than 1 million people? No, of course it doesn't. I mean, it would be ridiculous to suggest otherwise. Does that mean we shouldn't be doing it? No, not at all. Of course we should be doing it. We have, the United Kingdom, without much fanfare, been delivering aid by sea, by air, by road And the pier is just another way of getting aid in, and we're helping to organise the dispatch of that from Cyprus. We have the command and control ship in RFA Cardigan Bay in the Mediterranean, and so we're assisting with getting that aid onto the land in Gaza. Of course it's not enough. I mean, it would be ridiculous to suggest otherwise.
One final thing we want to raise with you. Tomorrow we're finally going to see the publication of the report into the infected blood scandal that affected so many people's lives over such a long time. Can you commit today to spending the £10 billion on compensation that we understand is on the way?
Well, I think it has taken far too long to get to this point. It's a problem that's gone on for decades. I had constituents come to see me, a family, a mother and father who sadly lost their son decades ago. And the idea it's taken all of this time to get to the truth, I think, is heartbreaking. I haven't seen the report yet. The government has already said that it will want to respond quickly to it. And so I know that that's what will happen.
But can you confirm the compensation will be paid in full?
I can't. I'm not in that position. We'll certainly want others and the Chancellor and the Prime Minister to talk about it. But I do know, as I say, from my own constituency casework, it's heartbreaking, and it's the system over decades having let down these families.
OK, Grant Shapps, thank you so much for coming in this morning and taking such a range of questions. It's always good to have you with us. Thank you. Well, the Tories clearly want to make defence a factor when it comes to the general election. And Keir Starmer wanted to show this week, well, he's properly up for the fight. He took his whole team to Essex, where, with placards and a queue of supporters on the platform, he announced what he's calling his 6 first steps for government. You heard Wes Streeting, the Shadow Health Secretary, canter through 5 of the 6 at the top of the show. He nearly got there. Promises on health, teachers and a stable economy. But they weren't a million miles away from the Labour leader's old jargon, the 5 missions. The idea, though, is a user-friendly list of promises of what Labour would do as soon as they move into number 10, if they win. Well, Wes Streeting is here. You've recovered from your 5 out of 6.
I'm never going to live this down. That's the thing. I'm never going to live this down. And where was the Arsenal solidarity, Piers? That's what I want to know.
The boss was there. I'll throw you under it.
Let's talk then about one of the key pledges in your area. If you are lucky enough to win and become Health Secretary, you're saying that you would deliver 40,000 more evening and weekend appointments a week, 2 million a year, and you'd do that by paying staff to work overtimes and weekends. But Keir Starmer said 40,000 operations. Some people have said appointments. So can we just start off with real exact clarity on what these 40,000 things would be? Do you mean hip operations, knee operations, cataract operations, or initial appointments with consultants, which people have also been waiting for?
No, it's to cut waiting lists. So whether that's people waiting for a diagnostic appointment or people waiting for those elective procedures that you mentioned, the goal here is to cut waiting lists. And the reason we know this will work is because it's currently being done in a small number of hospitals, including the London hospital I can literally see out of my office window in Westminster. We want to see this available to patients right across the country. We know that comes with an investment demand, £1.1 billion we've committed directly into the pockets of NHS staff. And as with so many of our other approaches to spending, that investment is linked to reform. So yes, more money to cut waiting lists, different ways of working so that we're using that operating theatre capacity, we're using that diagnostic capacity at evenings and weekends in the way that, frankly, we should already be doing.
But can you tell us what the mix would be between operations, major procedures like somebody getting a new hip or a new knee, or somebody having that first consultation with a consultant? Can you tell us what the mixture will be?
It's not about first consultation, it's to cut the waiting list. And to be clear, we're going to discharge the responsibility to ICBs, the Integrated Care Boards, pooling waiting lists across regions as well so that we can make best use of facilities, best use of staff. And we're going to trust them. You know, the goal is the 40,000 appointments to cut waiting lists. How they deliver, we're going to trust the front line.
OK, so you don't have a specific view.
We're not going to be that prescriptive from the centre.
Well, that's fine.
We want to trust leaders to do the right thing. And they've told us, give us the tools to do the job and we'll do it. And when Keir and I went to one of the Leeds hospitals that's taking this kind of approach, one of the things that was so clear to me was the abundant pride that staff who are delivering that service had, because yes, they're earning some extra money for themselves, you know, really important in a cost of living crisis, but they're getting the waiting list down, they're seeing the benefit for patients. So one of the challenges that's put to me is, well, you know, will staff want to do this? Will they, you know, and I think there is the appetite there. No one's going to be forced to do it. But where we give them the tools to do the job, NHS staff tell us time and time again they're up for the challenge.
You mentioned that hospital in Leeds, though, where this is already happening, but that trust also has a deficit of £100 million. And that trust in Leeds is having to make cuts already. And that's happening in quite a lot of places in the NHS. There's another hospital in Essex, not far from your constituency, where they're looking at cutting clinical roles. Now, if you become Health Secretary, would you tell trusts not to get rid of doctors and nurses?
Of course we don't want to see people getting rid of doctors and nurses, and you underline just how big the challenge is going to be if we win the next general election, because the NHS isn't just on its knees, it's on its face. And that's why, in terms of the approach I've set out, firstly, I've been incredibly candid about the state of the NHS, no dewy-eyed nostalgia and, you know, harking back to the past and resting on our laurels, but being honest about the state of the NHS today. Secondly, making it clear that Labour will invest in the NHS, but we also need to reform the NHS to make sure it works more effectively, because just this week we saw a pretty damning report on NHS productivity, and this government spends money in the wrong ways, in the wrong places, with worse outcomes, and that's got to change.
But those are principal things that you believe in, but there are already trusts having to get rid of staff. Now, if you're saying, well, you'll put more money in this end, or you'll increase the number of appointments over here, would you also say to trusts, stop getting rid of staff? And if so, would you give them more money so they don't have to get rid of staff?
Well, of course we don't want to see trusts getting rid of NHS staff.
So will you give them more money?
And we're going to have to work together to make sure that we're not being penny wise and pound foolish. But this is why we need a serious 10-year plan for the modernisation of the NHS, so we don't go through these repetitive cycles of year after year, crisis after crisis. And I'm afraid that's where we are after 14 years of Conservative government. So I can't promise to come in and wave a Labour magic wand on day one and all the problems go away. What I can promise is that we've got the right focus on investment and reform to do what the last Labour government did, which is deliver the shortest waiting times and the highest patient satisfaction ever.
But would you tell trusts and tell our viewers that you would tell hospitals to say, do not get rid of clinical staff?
Well, of course they shouldn't be getting rid of clinical staff, and we're going to have to work together to deal with the challenge that's been inflicted on the NHS by 14 years of catastrophic
But would you tell them not to? Because
government.
Right now, hospitals around the country, and we're talking about the NHS in England, are being told they have to focus on their deficits. They have to focus on getting costs down. Would you reverse that?
Well, we do have to get costs under control in the NHS. We don't want to see cuts to clinical roles on the front line. We are going to have to work seriously together to get the NHS from where it is today, worst crisis in its history, to where we want it to be, which is delivering the same kinds of standards of care that it did under the last Labour government, when we delivered the shortest waiting times and the highest patient satisfaction ever.
And one of the things the Labour government did at that era was use a lot of the private sector. Now, you've previously indicated on lots of occasions that you're very open to that, but how much would you use the private sector, and how much would you spend on the private sector?
Well, we want to use the spare capacity that exists in the private sector. They tell us they can do more, and we want to work with them to put together a serious plan that gives them some stability and certainty over the medium term about what they can deliver, at what cost. I'm determined to make sure we get both the reassurance we need on patient safety, but also value for taxpayers' money. So we're going to have to work in partnership.
So as things stand, you don't have a...
Well, we're talking already. Part of this is about negotiating in government. So there's only a degree to which we can do this in opposition. Mm-hmm. But we are thinking creatively too. Just today, we're announcing a partnership with Nuffield Health to deliver 4,000 appointments for NHS staff through their joint pain programme. We know that that's one of the reasons NHS staff are off sick and they're stuck on NHS waiting lists like everyone else. Those are the sorts of partnerships we want to see, and that's something we've agreed in opposition. We will hit the ground running on day one of a Labour government. It is going to take time to turn the NHS around, but we're determined to work together, public sector, private sector, to get the NHS back to where we want it to be.
Doesn't that then get you into a bit of a weird situation where the taxpayer would be paying a private company to give NHS staff free treatment?
No, it's free. It's part of Nuffield Health's charitable objectives. So There's no cost to the NHS, no cost to the taxpayer. Working with the private sector to bring down NHS waiting lists, obviously that is a contractual arrangement, and we've got to make sure we get good value for the taxpayer. But let's just take a step back and also recognise, against the backdrop of low growth, rocketing bills for families, one of the ways in which we get the economy growing again is to restore the health of the nation, because the health of the nation and the health of the economy are inextricably linked. And with almost 8 million people on NHS waiting lists, not only is that awful for them, it also sets back the economy, because if people are off work, they're not able to contribute to the economy and to our country's economic success. One
part of the country where people have also been struggling with their health is in Wales, where Labour runs the health service, and there you've got waiting lists at their second highest level, cancer waiting times at their second worst on the record. Why would anybody think that you, as Labour in charge in Westminster, would be able to do a better job of Labour in Wales, where the health service has got terrible problems?
Because right across the United Kingdom, every part of the NHS is in crisis, and all roads do lead back to Westminster, because even though this is devolved, decisions taken in Westminster have an impact on the NHS across the whole country. So I ask people, when they go to vote in the UK general election, to look back on Labour's proud record of delivering the shortest waiting times and highest patient satisfaction ever. I'm convinced that a Labour government in Westminster won't just deliver for the NHS in England, we'll create a rising tide that lifts all ships across the United Kingdom.
Well, hang on, because Labour's very happy to criticise the SNP in Scotland, which has terrible problems with the NHS in Scotland. But then when it comes to Wales, you're saying, oh, well, it's all Westminster's fault.
No, I'm saying that, if we have a Labour government in Westminster, investing in the NHS, as well as the reform and the modernisation, that benefits the NHS across the whole of the United Kingdom.
But are you proud of Labour's record in Wales on health?
Look, if the Welsh Health Minister were sat here now, Leonid would be saying that she's not happy with the performance of the NHS in Wales, and she's working hard to get waiting lists down and to improve the service. She also knows, as I suspect, the SNP's Health Minister Neil Gray wouldn't sit here, I suspect, on your programme and say, do you know what, a Labour government would be good for the NHS in Scotland, but privately, the SNP knows a Labour government in Westminster would be better for the NHS in Scotland. And Jackie Baillie, Labour's deputy leader and health spokesperson in Scotland, already has a plan to take the money that she would get from our policy of cutting waiting lists in England to do exactly the same in Scotland. So
I'll work in partnership. If the SNP would actually say that.
I'll work in partnership across the United Kingdom with all of the health ministers if I'm privileged enough to be the health secretary after the next general election. I'm absolutely convinced that we will create a rising tide to lift all ships across the UK, and the NHS will be better in Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland, not just in England, if we have a Labour government in Westminster.
OK, and just before we move on from health, the infected blood inquiry is coming tomorrow. Labour, are you committed to the most generous compensation package? So if the report comes out with a figure and the government says we're going to spend £10 billion on compensation, which is what we expect, would you match that?
Well, look, I really hope, and I've picked up the Sunday Times today with a huge sigh of relief, because it looks like the government is going to do the right thing, and they will have our wholehearted support in that, and we will make sure that victims have the certainty of knowing that if there's a change of government later this year, a Labour government will honour that commitment. So if Jeremy Hunt only does one thing before the general election as Chancellor, let it be justice for the victims of this scandal, because every 4 days another victim dies without justice, and justice has been delayed for far too long. I suspect all parties are going to have to take some pretty heavy criticism on the chin when Sir Brian reports tomorrow, including us, and we will take that criticism on the chin. Even more importantly, even in this election year where we're slugging it out for who governs Britain, I hope we can see that rare moment of consensus in our politics to put this situation right and to deliver the justice that victims deserve. OK, well, we'll see what happens tomorrow, but perhaps it will be one of those rare moments of unity in Westminster, and goodness knows they don't come along very often. Just lastly, I want to ask about Jeremy Corbyn, the former leader of your party. And the register of interests, where MPs have to declare their money, has shown that Jeremy Corbyn received £5,000 as a donation from a group called We Deserve Better. Now, it supports individual socialist candidates, and it's campaigning against Labour in some seats. Now, our viewers will remember Jeremy Corbyn is not sitting as a Labour MP at the moment, but he is still a member of the Labour Party. Do you think accepting a donation like that
supporting other socialist candidates is acceptable for a member of the Labour Party?
No, I don't think it is. Although, frankly, what Jeremy Corbyn does is no concern to me whatsoever any longer. He won't be a Labour candidate at the next general election. He won't be in Parliament after the next general election. And we've turned the page on that total failure in our history.
And lots of people in your party still do care about him. Should he be expelled from the party if he is working with this other campaigning group?
It would be for the Labour Party's disciplinary process to decide whether or not he's broken any rules. But the fact is, when Keir Starmer said he was going to change the Labour Party, he was serious and meant it. And the Labour Party is in a much better position now than we were in 2019 because we have understood why the public rejected us in such huge numbers. We've changed the Labour Party so we can be in a position to change our country. And I hope that when the general election comes later this year, that voters give change a chance and choose change by voting Labour. OK,
Wes Streeting, thank you very much indeed. Clear from you and Grant Shapps that an election is not that far off, even though it's still technically 6 months. It does feel like we're already in the election campaign. We're already here. Well, it's always great to have you here with us in the studio. Thank you so much, Wes Streeting, for joining us. Well, let's see what our panel have to say about our two interviews with us this morning. Mikaela, I want to come to you first because you do politics in a very different way. You know, you're describe yourself as an activist. What goes through your mind when you hear politicians talking like that?
I think they're very good at avoiding directly answering questions and making things seem a bit different than they actually are. I was also a medical student, and I thought the way that I could create change best in this world was becoming a doctor, because at school, if you're good at school and you're good at science, that's what they tell you to do. And then when I was on the wards, I actually noticed that a lot of people were sick, not because of, you know, just disease that was arbitrary, this thing that goes across the world, but it was because of the social conditions they're living in, because of their housing, because of poverty. And that what we'd be doing is people would be coming in, they'd be sick because of these like more social reasons. We would do an important job of making sure they can survive for longer, giving them medication and treating them, but then sending them back out into the same conditions that made them sick. And they just come back in a few months later with similar issues. And that's why I think what Wes Streeting was saying and what Labour is saying about you know, how we should tackle NHS waiting lists is to use the unused private capacity that also just doesn't really exist given the NHS doctors that are being used, is inadequate response. I think the issue is we have a very sick nation, and what we need to do is stop people from getting sick in the first place. And the way that we do that is to build a robust social care system and stop continuing these policies that are pushing people into sickness. Things like that I mentioned before about the two-child benefit limit, but also Labour are not saying they're going to roll back these policies that punish people for being poor and keep people in poverty.
OK, Piers, what did you make of what you heard this morning? You wanted to hear more from Grant Shapps on defence.
Yeah, I was quite encouraged by what he said. I think he does see the need to spend even more than the 2.5% pledge. And the reason, I think, is pretty clear. If you looked at only this week, the meeting between Putin and President Xi in China, the sort of bromance between these guys, coupled with Iran and their tentacles spreading with the collusion of the two of them, this is a dangerous threat to the West. And if you want to know about the impact of all these pledges, well, imagine if we had a situation Ukraine has. None of these pledges matter if actually you can't defend your country. And Ukraine's economy has been decimated, their people have been decimated. We have an absolute duty to defend them, but we also have a duty to defend ourselves. And I hope that both parties, if Labour get elected, that they commit properly to defence. You know, my brother was a British Army colonel, my brother-in-law, British Army colonel, extremely concerned about the state of our armed forces. They don't think we're ready to defend ourselves. On the NHS, you know, I had an experience. I think when you have a personal experience of the NHS, it really brings home to you the terrible state that it's in. And it's not a reflection on the staff, but on the institution. You know, my mother had a heart attack six months ago, and she was diagnosed at one hospital in Sussex. And then she was greenlit a few hours later, bluelit in an ambulance down to one of the major hospitals in Sussex. And from midnight until 7 a.m., she was kept on a trolley in A&E out in a corridor. And there were 40 other people lying on these beds out in a corridor. And when I talked about this with Rishi Sunak, when I interviewed him, the reaction I got from people all over the country was similar stories. Our A&E units are war zones. So I want to see a pledge not just about waiting lists, but also what happens when you absolutely need our health system. Is it going to be there for you? And are we going to give people dignity when they have these situations? Once my mother got taken up to the cardiac unit, amazing treatment, the best in the world. But before she got there, she could have died on a trolley in A&E, and it's just not acceptable.
Now, David, you've been backed the Conservatives for a long time, and you were a friend of Boris Johnson. I think you paid for his Caribbean holiday to Mystique. Are you happy enough now to still be backing them, to still keep funding them in the general election, when, as we've heard from these two, we know from the polls, we know from the local election results that the Tories are in the doldrums?
I remain fundamentally a Conservative supporter and a Conservative voter, and that's sort of in my blood, and that is the way it will continue. I accept and acknowledge that the economy and the country has had some very challenging times, but I do think if you look at Rishi Sunak's pledges and where he is against those pledges on the economy, on inflation and on these key points, we are beginning to get ourselves into a much better place, and therefore, yes, I would continue to be a supporter of them, because fundamentally, as a young person who grew up in the time of Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan and others, I believe in a free market, I believe in the fundamentals of capitalism, and I believe in individuals' rights to make their own way in life, and those are the fundamental sort of Conservative values that I continue to support.
And as part of your political activism, you've also purchased a while ago an Edstone replica, and we're going to talk about that a bit later in the programme, because it's one of the reasons why people know your name. But I just want to give people a glimpse. There is the Edstone in your garden at your house outside, I think, your theatre, but we'll talk about that a bit later on. Piers, since you were here last, and you know we have to address this, since you were here last, a High Court judge has ruled that you did know that there was hacking of voicemails when you were the editor of the Daily Mirror. Did you know that anyone at the paper was using material that they got by hacking voicemails?
No, and I've said this consistently in 20 years. I'm not going to say any more about it, other than to say they found in one case, I mean, I was the main story, I noticed, the BBC led on me for days.
You hate being the main story, of course.
Well, I didn't really, listen, it's fine. I mean, I find the whole idea of Prince Harry suing anyone for privacy involving the royal family, given how aggressively he's invaded the family's privacy himself, laughable. But on this central point, I've said for 20 years, I did not know about phone hacking at the Daily Mirror. They found one story in that whole case, which the judge concluded may or may not have come from phone hacking. And I'm sorry, that's not enough.
Well, the judge, and it's Judge Fancourt at the High Court, he accepted the evidence of several witnesses who claimed you were aware that stories you were publishing were the product of phone hacking. So you're saying today that the High Court is wrong, and they were wrong to say, and a quote from the judge, there was compelling evidence that the editors of each newspaper knew very well that voicemail interception was used extensively and habitually. Judge Fancourt is wrong.
Yeah, I'm going to repeat myself again. There is no evidence that I ever knew about phone hacking. And I would also say, in relation to those who trotted down to the High Court to give evidence, I was never allowed that privilege. I wasn't called by either side to talk about this at all. And yet I became the front poster boy for the trial, which I found ludicrous. There were a lot of people down there spewing utter nonsense.
But you say there's no evidence that you were aware.
There isn't.
But I'm asking you directly, were you
I've
ever
just
aware?
answered you.
And have you ever listened to a voicemail without the consent of the person whose phone it was?
No, you asked me that last time.
I didn't. Last time you didn't quite answer, which is why I'm asking you again.
Each time I come on, you can ask me the same questions. I don't mind. I've been asked about this for 20 years. There is no evidence that I knew. If somebody wants to produce some that doesn't involve people like Alistair Campbell trotting down, who spun this country into an illegal war, or Omid Scobie, who published a load of nonsense about the royal family, these people go down there and they're allowed to spray me in court, and I wasn't allowed to defend myself.
I'm giving you that opportunity right now, just to get this absolutely on the record. I'm not asking you, is there evidence? I'm asking you directly, have you ever listened to a voicemail message of somebody who did not have without their consent?
No, I've just answered you.
OK, and that's clear. And last time you didn't quite answer, and you have today, and
next
that's
time I come back, we don't have to have the same conversation.
Well,
because the BBC has, I have to say, the BBC has revelled in my involvement in this without any actual evidence to justify me being centre stage. And I don't blame you personally, but it is a little bit galling given I wasn't even involved in the case. Nobody called me on either side or put any of these questions to me. They just had a bunch of ne'er-do-well little chancers going down to court, spraying me with all sorts of nonsense, demonstrable, provable nonsense.
Well, you've had your chance to come
Thank
back
you.
on it today. I know that you're a believer in firm but fair questioning.
I absolutely
And you
am.
have had a chance to give your defence today. So thank you all three for now. We'll be back with you in a moment, because as we talked about at the beginning of the programme, we have been speaking to one of the close friends and allies of the former Russian opposition leader, Alexei Navalny. Putin's aggression didn't start in Ukraine. For years, he had been tightening the screw on his critics at home and putting them in danger abroad. Alexei Navalny died in prison in February, as you'll remember, after being locked up for his beliefs. But his close friend and ally, Leonid Volkov, was just a few weeks later attacked by men with hammers outside his home in Lithuania. He explained why, despite the dangers, the political battle against Vladimir Putin must go on.
There was a smash. The window was smashed. The driver, the left window of the car, well, on our side of the road where we drive in Europe, and the glass shards were like in my face, and so I kind of like reclined on the passenger's seat. I saw the guy with the pepper spray who sprayed it into me through the broken window, and I started to punch, to kick him, trying to kick him away, and with my left foot, and he started to smash it with the hammers that he had in his right hand. And after a while, after I made some noise with a car alarm and so on, he ran away. It was not a robbery. I had a backpack with some documents and money on the back seat of the car, and there was not an attempt to, steal something from me. He was not saying anything. There was no message. Like the message, the attack was the message.
What was that message?
Well, we know where you live. We can kill you. We are after you. And I mean, we still consider everything you guys are doing. So the Navalny's Foundation, the major threat to Putin's regime, which is actually a message also important to us. It was noticed.
But do you fear for your and your family's lives?
I don't fear. I always knew those risks exist. I mean, we always knew that we are fighting against a crazy fascist dictator, who doesn't recognize any red lines. He's killing thousands of people like every week in Ukraine. He's killed many of his political opponents. He's killed people in Europe. It's my intentional choice to fight against Putin, and the risks come with it. And I'm a bit surprised actually that everyone's talking about this attack against me, about this case, like, oh, Putin overstepped yet another red lines. Come on, he has left all red lines behind many years ago. He doesn't recognize any rules or any borders. He's killing people every day.
What happened to your dear friend Alexei Navalny shocked the whole world. How have you managed with it?
Well, first of all, it's not really possible to cope with that. Alexei was a close friend, a great guy, an inspiring personality, a true hero, and a great and very capable political leader. There is no substitution for him, and this loss will always be just like an open wound in our hearts, in the hearts of his colleagues and friends. But we also know that he asked us to never give up and to continue our work and to build this, to defeat Putin and to build this beautiful Russia of the future that Alexei dreamed of for so many years, is the only practical way to preserve his legacy and to make his ultimate sacrifice not to be in vain.
My message for the situation when I'm killed is very simple: not give up.
Everybody saw the terrible circumstances of your friend's death, but everybody's also seen the extraordinary courage and dignity of his wife, Yulia Navalny. Do you think that she is the leader of your movement now?
Everybody does. Yulia is also a very strong personality and a charismatic leader. She never wanted to be in this public role, and she was always a very close political advisor to Alexei. And for us, as for Navalny's organization, the teams that Navalny organized, like gathered together, it's very clear and natural that our task in this situation is just like to support Yulia and all her endeavors and everything that she does. And that's what we are doing now.
Russia seems to be advancing in Ukraine again. Are you worried about that? And what happens if Putin's allowed to win?
First of all, I don't think that Putin's victory is feasible. He is perfectly aware that the vast majority of population doesn't support the war and wants the war to stop, but he's like bluffing in a way, trying to present himself like much stronger than he is, hopeful that it will be enough to force Ukraine and its Western allies to enter some negotiation on the conditions Putin wants to have. Don't get bluffed.
What would you say to Western politicians, particularly in the United States, who've shown signs of fatigue when it comes to supporting Ukraine?
The message is very clear. Putin is war. Putin will not stop the war ever, and every ceasefire, every negotiation will be used by him only to produce more weapons, to recruit more soldiers, to get prepared to a more efficient next stage of the war. The second part of the message, it doesn't make any sense to negotiate to Putin. Putin signed the European Declaration of Human Rights, which he just like violates in every possible way. What sense does it make to try to sign yet another agreement with him when we are perfectly knowledgeable that he will not act upon what has been agreed?
What is the answer then if sanctions haven't dislodged Putin?
There is no single answer. There is no silver bullet. That's the largest evil in the world that we've seen since Adolf Hitler, and it's this comparison is absolutely okay for me. We don't have to hope that one magical trick will defeat him, but like military pressure, economic pressure, political pressure from inside, from outside, supplying more weapons to Ukraine, like everything. Like if there are 50 things we can do, we have to do all 50 of them. If we do 49, that's not enough, because that's the greatest threat to the world that we've seen in the last 80 years.
What is next for you, and what advice do you think your old friend Alexei Navalny would give you now?
Alexei Navalny's political message was never give up. The way he built his political organization, the Anti-Corruption Foundation, which I proudly represent here, was to make it as flexible as possible. So now we are more focused on international politics, supporting Yulia Navalny in her in promoting her agenda, in her travel and meetings, putting together sanction lists, using our knowledge of how Putin's regime is built to help the West tailor a more efficient sanction policy, doing many different things. But the cornerstone idea is to find the weak spots of the regime and to increase the level of stress, to do something that makes life harder for Vladimir Putin. People under stress tend to make mistakes, and Putin is also a human being, despite many proofs of the contrary. And he is also doing mistakes. And some of these mistakes will be his ultimate. But once again, we have to be patient and not to give up.
Leonid Volkov there, fascinating to hear from him at a time when, foreign affairs are so much part of our political conversation in a way that they're not always. Mikaela, leaders are being more explicit about the threats to us from around the world, but do you think that has an appeal to voters?
Well, I think they're being explicit about certain threats, but they're not talking about the climate crisis, which is one of the hugest threats to our security globally. Multiple reports have come out recently that have said so. And yet the funding that's needed for us to transition away from what is an economy that is forcing us towards destruction, and two, one that's actually better for all of us. Like, we have the opportunity with climate solutions to create a world in which all of us get to live in dignity, where all of us get to be safe, where people are not living in abject poverty and others have more than they could ever need to live on. And it's ridiculous to me that we're not focusing on that as a solution, and also focusing on it as this kind of exciting thing that we could have. And I think at the same time, I'd really like to, it's important to me to speak about what's happening in Palestine at the moment, and the fact that Israel are very deliberately targeting every form of civilian infrastructure that's necessary for people to live. Like, they have destroyed every university, they've destroyed hospitals, they've destroyed mosques, they've destroyed churches, and they've killed over 15,000 children, and yet our government is still licensing arms to them. It's absolutely abhorrent, and I think many people across the country are completely heartbroken by the images that they're seeing, and we should not be supporting Israel in their apartheid, in their occupation, and in their genocide of the Palestinian people.
Piers?
Well, listen, I agree that what is going on now in Gaza, I think, is unpalatable for pretty much everyone apart from Netanyahu and his government. But, you know, there's a lot of forgetting going on about what happened on October the 7th, where 1,200 people were slaughtered, nearly 7,000 more were wounded, many of them irrevocably badly. And I did check, Mikaela, to see what you tweeted, because you were very active on social media, what you tweeted after October the 7th. Do you remember?
I'm sure you'll
let me help you. Yeah. Nothing.
But I think
no, hang on. Here's my point. You were very influential. And so my point is, yes, you can be critical of Israel's government now and what they're doing by way of response. But if you literally had no reaction at all, even when you have such a massive influence, all you did was wait about 2 or 3 days and start talking about Israel genocide and response.
Okay, well, let Mikaela answer.
Yeah,
Please. Let Mikaela answer.
I think that to make out that what's happening right now is in response to October 7th is disingenuous, and it's not true. The fact that we need to look at the history. So this week we had to commemorate 76 years since the Nakba, and Nakba just means catastrophe in Arabic. And that was basically 76 years ago when Israel began the expulsion of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians. If I could share a story, my best friend, her grandfather, he turned 90 years old this year. He was born in Jerusalem in a free Palestine. He's 14 years older than Israel, and he was forced out of his home and is unable to return. And that's the story of hundreds of thousands and now millions of Palestinians. And so the idea that this is just in reaction to October 7th, when also every few years Israel does launch an attack that is known as mowing the lawn.
Well, it's a lot. There is, as you say, there's a lot of history, there's a lot of complexity. We've debated it a lot in the studio in the last few weeks, but I want to move on to something completely different, which there's also been controversy, but of a very, very different kind, about what's happened with this drama, Baby Reindeer. Now, it's been a huge hit on streaming services. David, you've watched it, I believe. What did you think about it?
I watched it, and I also watched Piers' interview. I found it a fascinating but slightly disturbing and difficult to watch series. I'm glad I did watch it. And I think it's very interesting that what then has subsequently arisen with the interview, and Piers is clearly much better placed than I to.
And the story briefly is about a woman who stalked an individual, and it's based, Netflix said, on a true story, but the woman who was depicted in it, in real life, has been very, very upset by how she's been treated. Briefly, Piers, what do you think of it?
I think it's a big problem for Netflix and for Richard Gadd and Clerkenwell Films who made this, because they say unequivocally at the start, this is a true story. And the denouement, if you haven't watched it, and spoiler alert, turn away now, but the denouement of the series involves the stalker in court admitting to her crimes and being given an 8-month prison sentence. Now, when Fiona Harvey, who's the real-life Martha, came on Piers Morgan Uncensored, she was emphatic. She's never been to court over this, she let alone plead guilty, and has never been to prison. Nobody can produce any evidence that she has. And if that is the case, and it turns out she hasn't, then the other part of this is the failure of duty of care by Netflix not to allow her to be identified, which she was instantly, because they used literal postings from her Twitter feed in the actual series.
So the story has some way to run. And can you, David, in 10 seconds, tell us why you have an Ed Stone in your garden as a Tory donor?
Well, when the Ed Stone disappeared, I was reading the papers one morning, and I thought it would be important that somebody could recreate or rediscover it. I am lucky enough to enjoy collecting some contemporary art in my garden, and I added this as a piece of contemporary art and a piece of social commentary.
A piece of social commentary and contemporary art.
Commentary.
A political commentary. OK, well, all three of you, thank you for all of your commentary today. It's been great to have you with us. We've covered a lot of ground. Oh, dear. Well, we'll see what happens at the football. You guys have also been busy getting in touch. And at the beginning of the programme, we asked you about those parties' pledge cards and vows, whatever you want to call them. Adam told us we need serious pledges on the green agenda, as Mikaela was saying, that are measurable and achievable. Amanda said no one mentioned housing, the biggest issue for poor people, young people, renters and even many pensioners. But John said hard decisions have to be made. I believe whoever's in power would be in the same position. A big thank you to you for all your comments. A big thanks to my panel and to our other guests as well. And the biggest thanks, of course, to you for watching. Keep your questions and comments coming. You know that we read them and we sometimes ask your questions. And there'll be plenty more placards, platforms and politics coming in the next few weeks and months. Both the Prime Minister and Keir Starmer are very obviously upping the pace. And Rishi Sunak, I think, is going to turn to immigration this week, expected to go off on his travels again to Austria. So tons more to come. We'll be back here next Sunday. Look forward to seeing you then. Same time, same place.